When we last left the rear suspension, we had discussed lots of designs and lots of ideas, most of them bad. But now it's time to pick one of these bad ideas and make it happen in the real world. So we will order parts from Send Cut Send, we will weld them together, we will change our mind and order new parts that we will weld together again. We will make links and brackets, and we will end up with a solid rear axle Dodge Viper, which actually kind of feels more correct than the independent suspension we took out. It takes a truly special engineer to make a Dodge more Dodge than Dodge did. We'll start with this, which isn't really part of the suspension, but we do need it to make the suspension work, or at least to make the drive shaft work with the suspension. We need to lower the back of the transmission and line up the output with the axle. I talked about this previously, but basically we need to just make a transmission mount. I designed this up a while ago and had it laser cut out. I welded it up and installed it. I also added some reinforcement plates to the frame to make sure it's nicely secured in there, partly because it might see a lot of load from rough suspension hits, but also because it's one of the lowest parts of the car now, so it might just smash into a rock on the trail. I should probably also add some protection for the actual transmission. I added some adjustability with holes in the brackets. This is probably unnecessary, but it was super easy and will help if I ever change my mind about ride height. It's currently in the middle and it'll need to be lowered to one of the bottom holes. Before I dropped the transmission, I had to remove the drive shaft, and I also had to remove the rear differential. The drive shaft comes off by removing the U-joint bolts, but these have tiny weird heads that are mostly rusted in place, so I busted out the problem solver. The problem solver actually solved many problems on this part of the project. Caused a few of them too, but mostly solved. I used it to cut out the entire rear frame section. I needed this part of it gone to clear the solid axle, but with that part gone, the rear lower part doesn't really have much stiffness and it doesn't really do anything. So I just did some weight reduction and cut out the whole thing. The lower rearmost part is used to hold on the rear fascia, which I'm not using anyway, but it did also have this cable bolted on both sides that runs through this plate that's riveted to the trunk floor. Not really sure why this is here, if it's for a crash or somehow a ground cable for the fiberglass trunk. Do I need to attach this to the frame? Somebody find out if I need this. With everything out of the way in the rear, it was time to install the new rear suspension brackets. Remember all this extra crap I designed to attach the suspension points to? Well, to attach it to the frame, I had to weld it. And to weld it, I have to continue my least favorite part of car projects, grinding off loads of paint and rust. I started with this piece down here. It welds to this frame tube and has a lot of load going through it, so it's important that it's welded correctly. I carefully welded it on, making sure it would never come off again, and then I realized I welded it on backward. This little triangle here is supposed to support this outside piece, not up to this frame piece here. Off to an excellent start. You know what? It's probably fine. We'll just mirror the CAD and pretend like that was the plan all along. Mounting these vertical plates that the rear links attached to was a bit of a challenge. I wasn't sure the best way to get them located, so I tack welded them to the crossbar and lifted the whole thing in. Then I just went to town with a welder. Should have bought a MIG, because this was a lot of TIG welding, and it was pretty tough to get in some spots. If I was a less entertaining YouTuber, I would do a 10-minute time lapse of me grinding, cutting, welding, and swearing, but I'll spare you the wasted time and just tell you that it was a lot of grinding, cutting, welding, and swearing. Since the wheel arches of the Viper are big to begin with, the new larger tires should fit in there just fine, but I did have to modify the frame in this spot. I cut out this protrusion and welded on a cover plate to clear the tire at full suspension compression. It should be fine everywhere else. We'll find out when I get it all installed, or possibly later in the desert with a flat tire. I made a few changes to my original design of these mounts. The first one was this bracket that I welded on incorrectly, but we don't need to talk about that anymore. I also removed a couple of pieces that didn't seem like they were doing much, and I added a little bit of reinforcement on the sides of this bar going across. I also added some steel to the back sides of these plates to kind of box them out. I painted it all with my favorite incredibly dangerous paint. This got most of it, but I will need to go back with a brush and some chassis paint to get in the cracks and crevices. If I'm honest, I don't love these mounts. I would up the thickness on these guys if I was to do it again, but I might feel different once it's all assembled. Let's find out. I mentioned in the last video that I decided to run the coilovers into the lower link. This is not done on the Jeep that the axle came out of. In fact, it's pretty rarely done in production, but it is popular on off-road builds, so much so that there are lots of companies that sell lower links for pre-runners and desert builds. They all look cool. I think that's important. It has to look cool, and it has to have your logo on it. All off-road stuff needs logos all over everything all the time. I bought some rod ends for the links. I just kind of guessed on how big they should be. Then they arrived, and I realized I guessed wrong. They are way bigger than they need to be. I decided to just keep the bigger ones on the lower links. I don't really need this size, but those links might see a lot of weird loads with the coilovers going into them, and they might also bang off of rocks and stuff, so I kept those. But I did go to smaller ones on the top links. To give you a sense of scale, this one is the size I'm using on the suspension of my Honda. With a fat rod end on the front and a fat spherical in the back, I just needed to connect these two with some metal and also have a place for the coilover to sit. It's kinked down like this for 3 reasons. One is to get the bottom of the shock where I need it to be. The other is to make sure the spring perch clears the lower link at full compression and rebound. And the third reason is that it puts the coilover mounting just below the axis between the two ends. So the spring pushing down always keeps the lower link oriented the correct way. The shocks need an 1.5 inch width for mounting, so I just ran a couple of 3/16 inch plates at that width the whole length and welded those up to the spherical cup and the threaded boss for the rod end. I boxed out the top and bottom, and then I layered up some extra metal on the outside, kind of where the coilover mounts. You can look at a simple free body diagram and see that the highest stress will be around here-ish, so I threw some extra metal at that area and called it a day. I added 3 possible mounting locations for the shocks, but I think I'm just going to use the rear one. I'm pretty happy with how these turned out. They look great, a lot less expensive than buying, and exactly what I needed. Except I forgot the logo. All good trailing links need a branded logo. Unfortunately, this one doesn't really lend itself to a laser cut pattern. But since Send Cut Send was nice enough to sponsor this build and has basically done all the hard work on all the suspension, I decided to throw on their laser gun logo. Nice. About this time, I decided to move my rear axle back 2 inches. I actually had already moved it back 1 inch, but I decided to go another inch. I did this partly so I'd have a little more extra length for the drive shaft. It's real short. But I also did it because at full compression, the axle swings forward a little bit, and I kind of want the wheel to be right in the wheel arch at full compression. Unfortunately, I had already made the lower links, and the threaded rod doesn't really have enough extra thread to extend another inch. Fortunately, I added extra holes in the suspension mounting. Unfortunately, they're too far apart. Fortunately, I can thread the rod end in all the way and make it work with the rear hole. Unfortunately, I can't fit the jam nut on there anymore. Fortunately, I can drill and tap the side to fit a set screw in there to keep it from rotating. Problem solved. The upper links are much easier. They're just hollow tubes with a rod end threaded in one side and a poly bushing added on the other. I added the bushing back here so I'll have some compliance in the rear. These links are not exactly parallel, so the system is slightly constrained from moving side to side. The Panhard Bar does move it a little side to side, so I'll need some compliance somewhere, and this seemed like a good place. I know some of you are disappointed that I decided against my overly complicated Matt's link with the Matty-Go-Rounds and the Panhard Bar. I do like things that are weird and different, but this off-road Viper is weird and different enough on its own, so I decided to go with the good old-fashioned Panhard Bar. It's been working for a century, so it's slightly more proven than some bullcrap I came up with a few weeks ago. The rear axle I'm using is from a Jeep Rubicon, but the Panhard mount on the axle massively interferes with the Viper frame under compression. I can lower the axle side mount, but I'd have to lower the body side mount also, which is not ideal. The drawback of using the Panhard Bar on this car was always that there's no frame structure down here where I need the body side of the bar to mount to. There was, before I sawzalled it all into oblivion, but since I had to cut out this section anyway, it wouldn't have been very well constrained. The problem is that I need a mount dropping way down to pick up the body side of the bar. To get any stiffness, I need to run some structure to the other side of the frame as well, and it's all just a lot of material hanging down all droopy-whoopy. So I looked at how some other vehicles did it and found they all just have structures hanging down. This is just how it's done. So I just did it. I started to get creative with the laser cutting, making it all fancy because why not? But then I decided to just buy a tube since that was easier and probably better. As for the axle, I chopped off that weird growth on the top and designed my own axle side mount. I added 3 mounting holes for some adjustability in here because apparently that's just what I'm doing all the time now. This puts my Panhard Bar lower than it was on the Jeep that this axle came off of, but it's closer to the 4Runner and pretty close to where the Bronco has their bar. I mostly just copied the Bronco suspension geometry for everything else, so this seems fitting. I welded it all up, again wishing I had a MIG welder, but it did turn out really nice. This is all looking so good. As for the Panhard Bar itself, it comes with an unnecessary rant. Some of you have noticed that I've done almost no actual engineering on this. Like those lower links where I said the stress probably looks something like this, I just threw some metal in there and called it a day. That's not really engineering, and yet it's still more engineering than most aftermarket off-road companies have ever done. Take the Panhard Bar, for instance. It's a pretty simple design. It's a tube with threaded bosses welded into the ends and rod ends threaded in. Super simple engineering too. It's either going to fail in buckling, like my tie rod did a few weeks ago, or in tension, as in ripping apart. Tension calculation is super easy. You just measure the cross-sectional area of the tube and then multiply that by the yield strength of the material. Buckling is a little more complicated. You have to use equations with curly, funny-looking symbols, but it's still pretty easy. I'm not sure how strong this thing needs to be. If it was a track car, it'd be pretty straightforward. We could calculate the load in it by just looking at cornering forces and adding a safety factor. Off-road, it's a little more difficult because the loads are kind of weird and random. Aftermarket off-road companies solve this problem by just throwing obscene amounts of mass at every part. Most of these guys are using 3/8" wall or bigger on their track bars, like this one on my 4Runner. It's an 1.25" diameter with a 3/8 wall, which gives it a strength and tension of about 70,000 pounds. That would be over 10 times more than you need for that track car we just talked about. And you do see those weird high loads off-road, but here's the thing. The same bar will buckle at just 20,000 pounds. So it's over 3 times stronger in one direction than the other direction. Moreover, if they just increased the outside diameter a tiny bit but kept the same wall thickness, then the buckling strength could be increased to the same 70,000 pounds. I still think this is way too much. 20,000 is probably also too much. I didn't cut open the bar that came with the Jeep that this axle came out of, but it comes from the factory with a bend in it, so I'm guessing its buckling strength is probably half of that. There are sometimes reasons to use heavier wall material on off-road vehicles, especially on parts low down that might be banging off of rocks and stuff, but if you're slamming your track bar on rocks, it's probably because you just ejected your axle out of the back of your car. So with a tiny amount of actual engineering, I designed my bar to be a slightly larger 1.5" diameter with a wall thickness of 1/8 of an inch. I'm also using mild steel. This puts my yield strength at about the same as my buckling strength, both about 20,000 pounds, but it weighs half as much and costs much less than the one in my 4Runner. But then I remembered all the times I was wrong and how it might be arrogant to assume that I'm smarter than every aftermarket off-road company, so I bumped up the wall thickness to 3/16. Also, I'm not doing any engineering on this part it attaches to, or this part, or any of this stuff. So I'm basically like a C+ student criticizing kids who didn't even bother to go to class. So let's just get back to building stuff all willy-nilly. With the links done, I bolted them into the axle and slid it under the car to assemble it all together in one amazing Mopar monstrosity. Mopar-strosity. Too bad I can't fit that on a license plate. The body side needed spacers to fit the rod ends in the right place, but I waited until everything was in roughly the right location before I measured and made those. I was a little worried that the welded brackets might have been off-center slightly, so I made sure the axle was centered in the body and then measured where the rod ends landed between those brackets. They were pretty much dead center, so that was nice. With the axle in roughly the right place, it was time to install the body side Panhard mount. To do this, I first needed to cut away a bunch more brackets. The return of the problem solver. There were a bunch of brackets here that were not in my CAD model, mostly because I didn't bother to CAD model any of them. At least 80% of this project is cutting away brackets and welding in new brackets. I placed the body side Panhard mount and tacked it in, making sure it was lined up with the axle side Panhard mount. Then I continued to remove the remnants of brackets that were not adequately removed the first time. I'm getting to that point where it would have been easier to just design an entirely new frame for the Viper. I clamped in the bar that attaches the Panhard mount to the other side of the frame and welded that in. I actually like how this looks. I thought it might be flimsy looking, but it looks substantial, a lot better than I thought it would. As for the bar itself, that was a more complicated install than I was expecting. See, I closed off these mounts where they're just pockets with one opening, so I couldn't slide the bar in. I tried screwing the rod ends all the way in, but that didn't work. I had to drop the axle down and try again. It took some hammering to get this in there, obviously by using the correct tool and not just whatever wrench I had lying around. In the process, I realized I had these holes out here laser cut too large. They're too big for the bolts, so I'll need to weld on some plates that reduce their size. With the bar in and everything else installed except the shocks, I decided to swing it through its travel to make sure everything worked. And it didn't. Not even close. The upper link interferes with the mount, like a lot. I know it seems like I'm just kind of dumb and didn't consider this possible interference before putting this all together, but what actually happened is that I'm kind of dumb and didn't even consider this possible interference. Really, I just didn't draw the upper link. I just kind of had these spindly looking kinematic things. I'm not good with details, but I am good with a Sawzall and a welder, and in the end, that's really all that matters. I might just move it to the lower hole here. I'll have to remove that jam nut and add a set screw like I did on the lower link, but that is tomorrow's problem. I was hoping this would be a rolling chassis video where I have the suspension done and the car rolling on its own, but I have so much left to do. All the big stuff is there, but there are lots of little things left to do. I need to modify the frame up front to make sure the coilovers will fit. I gotta modify the actual shocks. Need to grind some metal off the lower control arms. I need to make new spring perches. I kind of want to get the brakes finished because when a car can roll, it's good to be able to stop it from rolling. Lots of stuff needs paint, a bunch of other stuff here and there, but it is surprisingly close to rolling. Actually pretty close to driving. or at least pretty close to making lots of new mistakes, and a lot of new solutions. I don't always get away with winging it. I do sometimes, but not because I'm lucky. It's because I've crammed my brain full of math, science, and engineering, and while I've forgotten most of it, I do sometimes stir the pot of knowledge by going over things I learned back in the previous century. It's there, but it takes some stoking to remember. Brilliant is great for this. Tons of math and engineering reminding me that I do actually understand this. Oh yeah, I remember now. It's also great for learning new things. The courses cover the spectrum, so everyone from students to professionals and lifelong learners can pick up new things, remember old things, and hopefully make fewer mistakes in their lives. And it teaches in a way that helps me grasp those concepts, so they might actually stick around this time. Puzzles, diagrams, visual representations. Brilliant teaches you the concept, not just a bunch of squiggly lines and rote memorization. Give it a shot. It's free for 30 days. Just visit brilliant.org/superfastmatt or click the link in the description. The first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. It used to be that you had to impress people to get people to watch your show. Now you just have to impress the algorithm. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. All hail the algorithm.